Before anyone noticed the body, before questions were asked, something far quieter happened. The old clock tower stopped. Not at midnight, not at dawn, but at a moment so ordinary that no one thought to remember it. In villages like this, silence is never empty. It watches. It waits. And when it finally speaks, it changes everything. Chapter 1. The old clock tower stood at the edge of the village like a patient witness. Its stone face was weathered by decades of rain and quiet mornings. Every villager passed it without thought. Time was something they trusted. It moved forward without question. Until one night, when it did not. Miss Marple noticed the silence before anyone mentioned it. She always did. It was early morning, the kind of morning where mist sits low and sound travels slowly. She walked with measured steps along the lane. Her knitting bag rested against her arm. The tower should have been marking the hour. Instead, there was nothing. No ticking, no chime, just the soft sound of birds unsettled by the stillness. She paused and looked up. The clock hands were frozen. 11:40, a curious time. Not midnight, not dawn, a time between moments. She felt a small tightening of thought. Machines fail. People fail more often. Yet this felt deliberate. The absence itself felt arranged. Villagers soon gathered. Mr. Harris, the postman, frowned and adjusted his cap. Mrs. Bell clutched her coat tighter and spoke of damp gears. Someone laughed nervously. The silence made people uneasy. Miss Marple listened. She watched their faces, the way voices filled the space that the clock had abandoned. Then came the news. A body had been found near the tower steps. Mr. Leonard Finch, a man known for punctual habits and quiet authority. He chaired committees. He kept ledgers. He never missed appointments. Now he lay still where time itself had stopped. The constable arrived. Calm. Polite. Certain this was a misfortune. A fall, perhaps. Finch had climbed the tower often. He supervised its upkeep. An unfortunate slip. The villagers accepted this explanation with relief. Accidents allowed life to continue unchanged. Miss Marple did not argue. She rarely did. She merely observed the steps, the angle of the body, the neatness of Mr. Finch even in death. His watch had stopped too. 11:40. She bent slightly and adjusted her shawl. It was not the fall that troubled her. It was the order of it all. The stopped clock. The stopped watch. The man who lived by routine meeting his end at a moment that no one could easily place. She thought of habits. People relied on them. They built their days upon them. And those who knew habits well knew how to use them. As the body was taken away, the tower loomed larger. Its silence felt heavy now. Miss Marple felt certain of one thing. This was not the end of a story. It was its beginning. She walked home slowly, each step measured, each thought gentle but firm. When time stopped, someone wanted it that way. By afternoon, the village had settled into hushed conversations. Curtains moved. Teacups were lifted with careful hands. People spoke in low voices as if sound itself might disturb something fragile. The clock tower remained still, its hands unchanged. 11:40 watched over everything. Miss Marple sat by her window knitting. The needles clicked softly, a rhythm she trusted. Outside, children passed without laughter. Adults glanced at the tower and then away. Silence invites imagination. Imagination breeds fear. Visitors came. Mrs. Bell spoke first. She brought cake. She always did when unsettled. She talked of weather and repairs. She insisted the tower had needed maintenance for years. Miss Marple nodded. She asked gentle questions. Not about the death, about routines, about who visited the tower, about who cared deeply for its timing. Mrs. Bell hesitated when she mentioned Mr. Finch. She spoke of his strict nature, his insistence that the clock must never be wrong. Miss Marple thanked her kindly. She filed the hesitation away. Later, Mr. Harris arrived. He spoke of delivering letters, of seeing Finch the previous evening. Finch had checked his watch and the clock together. He had frowned, said something about corrections, adjustments. Harris could not recall the exact words. That bothered Miss Marple more than if he had. As evening approached, the constable returned. He was polite. He assured her everything was in order. An accident, most likely. Miss Marple smiled. She offered tea. He declined, in a hurry to reassure others. When he left, she rose and looked again at the tower. The light was fading. Shadows lengthened. The frozen hands caught the last glow of day. She thought of motives that did not shout. Motives that whispered. Fear of exposure. Fear of loss. Fear of time revealing something long hidden. Miss Marple knew this village. She knew how people smiled when comfortable and stiffened when not. The tower had been a constant, a silent keeper of many moments. Someone had used that constancy. She returned to her chair. The knitting resumed. The rhythm steadied her thoughts. Tomorrow the clock would be repaired. Time would move again. But the truth would not rush. It never did. For now the village slept under a paused hour. And Miss Marple waited. Chapter 2. Morning arrived with a pale light that seemed reluctant to touch the village. Mist drifted along the hedgerows and softened the edges of cottages. The clock tower remained still. Its hands held their place like a stubborn memory. 11:40. Miss Marple walked toward the green at a gentle pace. The village had called a meeting at the parish hall. They said it was to discuss repairs. They said it was to reassure everyone. They did not say it was to calm their own nerves. A village can speak around fear for quite a long time. The parish hall smelled of polished wood and old hymn books. Folding chairs stood in neat rows. The kettle steamed in a corner. People arrived in pairs and small groups. They lowered their voices as they crossed the threshold. When a door closes behind a person, the room feels smaller. Secrets always make a room smaller. Miss Marple chose a seat near the side, close enough to see clearly but not so central that she became part of the meeting's performance. She placed her knitting bag at her feet. The needles remained inside for now. Today she needed her eyes more than her hands. At the front stood Mr. Gerald Pike, chairman of the parish council. He was a careful man with a careful smile. His suit seemed too clean for a village morning. He spoke of community spirit and practical needs. He thanked everyone for coming. He offered condolences in a tone polished by habit. Near him stood Mrs. Eloise Crampton, who managed the village charity shop and knew everything that passed through other people's hands. Her mouth stayed tight. Her eyes darted from face to face. She was listening for more than words. Also present was Mr. Samuel Rook, the clock repairman from the nearby town. He carried a leather case and an air of modest patience. He was not local, which meant villagers could look at him without worrying what their looks might mean later. Outsiders are often used as mirrors for shared anxiety. Constable Wren took a seat near the aisle. His uniform sat neatly on him. He held a small notebook and an expression that hoped for cooperation. The village looked at him as if he represented order. Miss Marple knew better. Order was something people performed when they wished to believe in it. Mr. Pike began with the clock. He explained that Mr. Finch had overseen the tower for years. He said Finch had kept records of maintenance and scheduled checks. He said the village had lost a dependable man. He did not mention the way Finch's watch had stopped at the same minute as the clock. Mr. Rook cleared his throat and described the tower's mechanism in simple terms. The gears were old. The weight system was delicate. Damp weather could cause a slip. Yet he frowned slightly as he spoke. He said it was unusual for such a complete stop. A single fault might make the chime fail. Another might slow the hands. A full halt suggested something more direct. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone coughed. People do that when they feel a thought moving too close to the truth. Miss Marple watched Mrs. Bell, who sat in the second row with her hands clasped in her lap. Mrs. Bell owned the tea shop on the corner. She was a woman of warmth and flower and kind words. Today her gaze stayed fixed on the floor, as if she feared what she might see if she looked up. Across the aisle sat Mr. Anthony Sedgwick, a retired schoolmaster with sharp eyebrows and a talent for disapproval. He spoke before anyone invited him. He complained that the tower had been neglected. He said Finch had been overbearing but effective. He suggested that the village should have replaced the mechanism years ago. Mrs. Crampton responded with an odd brightness. She reminded everyone that funds were limited. She pointed out that Finch had refused donations at times. He insisted on proper accounting. He insisted on knowing where every coin came from. The air changed slightly after that. Miss Marple felt it the way she felt a shift in weather. Finch had touched money. Money touches nerves. Mr. Pike raised a hand and asked for calm. He said this was not a place for accusations. The word accusations seemed to linger in the air like smoke. Constable Wren stood then. He spoke gently. He said the death was still being examined. He said nothing could be ruled out. His polite caution sounded like a warning wrapped in a ribbon. Miss Marple noticed how Mr. Pike's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. She noticed how Mrs. Crampton's face went still for a moment before she forced it back into expression. She noticed that Mr. Sedgwick leaned forward as if he wished the constable to look at someone else. The meeting moved to practical matters. Mr. Rook said he would inspect the mechanism in the tower. He would need keys. Mr. Pike said Finch's keys were with the police. Constable Wren nodded. He would arrange access. A woman at the back raised her hand. Miss Violet Arden, who ran the small guest house near the lane. She asked whether the tower would remain closed. Her voice sounded steady, but her eyes were not. She said guests were nervous. She said rumors were bad for business. Mr. Pike assured her that the village would not allow gossip to harm their reputation. At the word reputation, Miss Marple saw two heads turn quickly and then turn away. People who care about reputation often have reason to. When the meeting ended, people gathered near the kettle. The tea was too strong. The biscuits were too dry. Still hands reached for them. Food gives the illusion of normality. Miss Marple moved among the small clusters, quietly. She offered condolences in soft tones. She asked small questions. She listened. Listening is a skill that grows sharper when people underestimate you. She heard that Finch had argued with Mr. Pike recently over the council budget. She heard that Finch had visited the charity shop late last week to check receipts. She heard that Finch had been seen walking toward the tower at dusk the night he died. Some said he was alone. Some said they could not be sure. Uncertainty is a useful hiding place. Mrs. Crampton approached Miss Marple with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She said the village was lucky to have Miss Marple among them. She said older eyes see things others miss. Miss Marple thanked her kindly. She noted how Mrs. Crampton's fingers worried at the edge of her sleeve as she spoke. As people began to leave, Miss Marple looked out through the hall's small window. The tower stood visible across the green. Still. Watching. Unchanged. She thought of how the village had trusted that tower for so long. How many people had arranged their lives by its sound? How many secrets had been carried beneath its shadow? The meeting had been called to discuss repairs. Yet it had revealed something more. It revealed tension. It revealed fear. It revealed that Mr. Finch had been a man who touched the most sensitive parts of village life. Money. Reputation. Control. Miss Marple walked home with slow steps. Behind her the voices faded. Ahead the tower waited. She felt sure now that the clock had not simply failed. It had been stopped. And whoever stopped it had done so with knowledge of the village and knowledge of Mr. Finch's habits. That meant the danger was not in some distant stranger. It was close. It was familiar. It was dressed in ordinary clothes and ordinary manners. In the quiet of her sitting room, she placed her knitting on her lap and began again. The needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm. Outside the tower remained silent. Inside her mind, the village had begun to speak more clearly. The truth often begins like that. Not with a loud revelation, with a small pattern that repeats until it can no longer be ignored. Miss Marple kept her eyes on the stitch, yet her thoughts stayed on the paused hands of the clock. 11:40. It was a time chosen by someone, and she intended to learn why. That evening the village seemed lit from within by nervous energy. Lamps glowed behind curtains. Smoke rose from chimneys in soft columns. It was the sort of winter calm that usually feels comforting. Tonight, it felt like a cover. Miss Marple had been invited to tea at the vicarage. Invitations often increase when trouble arrives. People reach toward familiar rituals, because they believe rituals can hold the world steady. The vicarage was warm and smelled of lemon polish and baking bread. Reverend Lucian Hart greeted her with gentle eyes. He was a man who tried to carry other people's worries without letting them crush him. His wife, Margaret, placed a plate of small cakes on the table, as if sweetness could soften what had happened. They spoke at first of simple things: the weather, the garden, the inconvenience of the broken clock. Then the conversation turned, as it always did, toward Mr. Finch. Reverend Hart spoke kindly of him. Finch had been strict but fair. He had kept the church accounts precise. He had corrected the vicar once over a charity fund. He had done it politely but firmly. The vicar admitted he had been irritated at the time. Now he felt only regret. Margaret Hart poured tea and said Finch had seemed troubled lately. She had seen him walking alone in the evening. He had looked as if he carried a worry he did not wish to share. Miss Marple asked what kind of worry. Margaret hesitated. She said she did not know, yet she mentioned a detail. Finch had begun checking the church notice board more than usual, as if he was looking for something, or as if he feared something might appear there. A small detail. Yet details are often doors. After tea, Miss Marple took the longer route home. She preferred the lane that passed near the tower. The path was quiet. Frost glittered faintly on the grass. Her breath rose in a thin cloud. The tower stood darker now against the night sky. Its face was visible in the moonlight. The frozen hands looked almost unnatural. A clock is supposed to move. When it does not, it resembles a stopped heart. Miss Marple paused near the base. The door to the tower was locked. She could smell cold stone and damp wood. She could also smell something else. A faint hint of oil. Fresh oil. Her mind held that scent. Mechanisms need oil, yet the repairman had not begun work yet. If the tower had been oiled recently, it meant someone had been inside. Perhaps Finch. Perhaps someone else. She turned away and continued home. She did not want to linger too long in the open. People notice those who stand near a place where trouble happened. As she entered her cottage, she saw a figure across the road, half hidden near the hedge, a person standing too still, watching the tower, or watching her. In the dim light, she could not see the face clearly. The figure moved away as soon as she looked directly. Inside, she lit a lamp and sat by her fire. She did not allow fear to settle. Fear wastes energy. Instead, she allowed herself to think. The meeting had shown her several things. Mr. Pike cared deeply about keeping the village calm and tidy. Finch had challenged him over money. That could breed resentment. Yet resentment alone is rarely enough for such a carefully placed death. Mrs. Crampton had been nervous when the constable spoke. Finch had checked her receipts. She was a woman who handled donations and cash. If Finch had found something improper, he might have threatened exposure. Exposure can push people to desperate choices. Mr. Sedgwick, the schoolmaster, disliked Finch, yet his dislike felt clean and open. People who intend harm often hide their feelings. Sedgwick displayed his too proudly. Miss Violet Arden worried about rumors because they harmed business. Yet she also seemed frightened in a deeper way. The guest house saw strangers come and go. Strangers can bring danger. Or they can bring opportunity. Finch might have learned something about her guests. Something that could harm her if known. There was also the repairman, Mr. Rook. An outsider, yet outsiders do not know village routines well enough to stop time at a moment that carries meaning. The stopped clock and Finch's stopped watch felt symbolic. Someone wanted that time fixed in everyone's mind. 11:40 was not an accident. It was a message. Miss Marple opened her knitting bag and drew out her needles. The clicking sound filled the room softly. As she knitted, she imagined the night again. Finch walking toward the tower, perhaps with keys in his pocket, perhaps with urgency. A man who believed in order would not ignore a stopped clock. He would go to correct it. If someone wanted Finch alone, the tower was the perfect lure. They could interfere with the mechanism earlier. They could stop it at a chosen time. Then wait. Finch would come. He would come, because that was his nature, and nature is predictable. She pictured Finch climbing the narrow steps, the cold stone under his hand, the smell of oil and dust, the sound of his own breathing. He might have believed he was alone. But someone could have followed, someone who knew his habits and knew the tower well enough to move quietly. A push. A slip. A fall. People call such things accidents, because accidents feel safer than intention. Yet an accident would not stop Finch's watch exactly at the same time as the tower clock unless the timing mattered, unless someone made sure. Miss Marple considered another possibility. Perhaps Finch had been attacked not by force, but by fear. A sudden shock on steep steps can be enough. People misstep when startled. A whispered name in the dark. A hand on the shoulder. A threat. Finch could have stumbled, not shoved but frightened. That would make it easier for the village to believe it was accidental. The murderer would not need strength. Only timing. Only knowledge. Only the ability to choose the right moment. The right moment had been chosen. Miss Marple let her thoughts drift to the scent of fresh oil. If someone had oiled the mechanism, they might have done it to prevent noise. A dry gear can squeal or click. Oil quiets. Quiet allows a person to work unseen. She looked at the stitches forming under her fingers. Patterns reveal themselves slowly. This is why she loved knitting. It reminded her that truth can be made stitch by stitch. It requires patience. It requires steady hands. It requires a willingness to notice when something does not match. A knock came at her door. Gentle, not urgent. She rose and opened it. Constable Wren stood outside. His face looked tired. He held his cap in his hands, as if he did not wish to appear official. He said he was making rounds. He said he wanted to ensure everyone felt safe. Miss Marple invited him in. She offered tea. He accepted this time. He sat near the fire and looked around as if her small cottage offered him relief from the village's watchful eyes. He spoke carefully. He said the doctor could not yet be certain. The fall had caused death. That was clear. But there were marks that suggested Finch had been startled. His hands had scraped stone in a way that suggested sudden loss of balance. He had not simply slipped. Miss Marple asked whether anyone else had been near the tower that night. Constable Wren said several people claimed they were at home. Some claimed they were out walking. No one had seen anyone clearly. Mist had been thick. He paused. He admitted that he did not like coincidences. A stopped clock, and a dead man at the same minute. Miss Marple said quietly that coincidences often depend on who arranges them. He looked at her then with a new seriousness. He asked if she suspected someone. Miss Marple smiled gently and said she suspected habits. She suspected fear. She suspected that someone had used the tower as a trap. Constable Wren left after a while. His steps sounded heavier on the path. Miss Marple closed her door and returned to her chair. Outside the village slept uneasily. Inside her cottage the fire crackled and the needles clicked. She felt a calm certainty settle in her mind. Mr. Finch had gone to the tower because he believed in order. Someone else had gone because they feared what Finch might reveal. The stopped clock had been bait. The chosen time had been a signature. Miss Marple looked toward the window. The tower was not visible from here. Yet she could feel its presence, as if the village itself was built around it. Soon the repairman would open the mechanism. He would see where it had been interfered with. He would find evidence. Perhaps small, perhaps overlooked, and when he did, someone in the village would become very interested in what he said. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. Her hands were steady. Her mind was steady. She did not need haste. Haste makes people careless. She needed only to keep watching. In a village, the truth does not hide far. It hides in plain sight. Chapter 3. The morning the clock tower was opened again felt different from the others. The village woke earlier than usual. Curtains were drawn back with care. Doors opened and closed softly. People pretended to continue their routines. Yet every step carried them closer to the green. Miss Marple arrived before most. She stood at a distance, her gloved hands folded calmly, her gaze steady. The tower door was open now, its dark interior exposed. Mr. Samuel Rook knelt beside his leather case, laying out tools with quiet precision. Constable Wren stood nearby, notebook in hand, his posture relaxed but attentive. The tower interior smelled of stone, old wood, and oil. Miss Marple noticed again that faint, sharp scent. Fresh oil had a clarity to it. It did not blend with the older smells. It announced itself to anyone who knew machines. Mr. Rook climbed the narrow stairs slowly, testing each step. He paused often, listening. A mechanism speaks if one knows how to hear it. The villagers below waited in an uneasy cluster. Some stared upward. Others avoided looking at the tower at all. Miss Marple watched the people instead. Mrs. Crampton stood slightly apart, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Mr. Pike spoke quietly to Miss Violet Arden, his voice low and reassuring. Mr. Sedgwick leaned on his cane and watched everything with open suspicion. Minutes passed. The village held its breath. Mr. Rook descended at last. His expression had changed, not alarmed, thoughtful. He spoke to the constable first. His voice was calm but firm. He said the mechanism had not failed on its own. One of the weights had been deliberately disengaged. It was not damage. It was adjustment. Someone had known exactly which part to touch. A murmur moved through the crowd like a slow ripple. Mr. Rook continued. He said the oil on certain gears was fresh. It had been applied carefully, not by chance. He explained that oil would quiet movement. It would prevent small sounds that might alert someone nearby. Miss Marple felt a familiar sense of confirmation. She had expected this. Still, seeing truth step into daylight always carries a weight. Constable Wren asked who might have had access to the tower. Mr. Pike answered quickly. Only Mr. Finch and the council members. He named himself. He named Mr. Sedgwick. He named Mrs. Crampton. He hesitated before naming Miss Arden. She was on the list because she had once organized a charity event that required access to the tower balcony. Miss Marple noticed the hesitation. Names matter. The order they are spoken matters too. The constable thanked Mr. Rook and asked him to leave the mechanism untouched for now. Evidence needed to be recorded. Mr. Rook nodded. He gathered his tools quietly and stepped back. Outsiders often retreat at the first sign of deeper trouble. The villagers began to talk. Voices overlapped. Explanations appeared. Mr. Pike spoke of responsibility and the need to cooperate. Mrs. Crampton protested that she had never climbed the tower alone. Mr. Sedgwick scoffed and said this proved Finch had been murdered. His tone carried satisfaction more than shock. Miss Marple moved slowly among them. She listened. She watched how people placed their feet, how they avoided certain eyes, how they repeated certain phrases. She heard someone mention that Finch had been upset about something discovered weeks ago. She heard another say Finch had argued with Mrs. Crampton late one evening. She heard a third insist that Finch trusted Miss Arden more than anyone. Each statement added a thread. Later, when the crowd thinned, Miss Marple approached Constable Wren. She asked him how Finch had been found. He told her again. At the base of the stairs, one hand outstretched, his expression surprised rather than frightened. Miss Marple asked whether Finch had called out. The constable said no one had heard anything. The tower walls are thick. Sound does not travel easily there. She asked whether Finch's keys had been found. Yes, in his pocket. That meant he had unlocked the door himself. He had entered willingly. That knowledge settled something in her mind. Finch had not suspected danger. He had believed he was doing his duty. As the morning wore on, the constable dismissed the villagers gently. He asked them to remain available for further questions. He locked the tower door again. The hands of the clock remained frozen. Miss Marple walked home slowly. Her thoughts moved backward now, not forward. She thought of the past. Villagers have long memories, even when they pretend to forget. She recalled a conversation from years ago. Finch had once mentioned the tower's records. He had said the logbooks went back decades. Repairs, donations, alterations, all carefully recorded. He had sounded proud. She also recalled something else. Years ago there had been a small scandal. Funds raised for a memorial had gone missing. The matter had been smoothed over. No one had been accused. Life had continued. Miss Marple paused by her gate. She felt the shape of something emerging. Not yet clear, but close. She knew that Finch had not only kept time. He had kept records, and records can threaten people long after the moment they record has passed. Inside her cottage, she sat by the window. The light shifted slowly across the room. She took out her knitting and began again. Her mind traced the pattern of events. Someone had known Finch would come to the tower. Someone had prepared the mechanism. Someone had waited. And someone had feared what Finch might do next. The past does not stay buried unless everyone agrees to keep it so. And someone had decided that agreement was about to break. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the church. Not for prayer, though she believed in the comfort of quiet spaces. She went for the records. Churches remember what people prefer to forget. Reverend Hart welcomed her with a gentle nod. He did not ask why she had come. In troubled times, people accept visits without questions. They sat at a small table near the vestry. Dusty ledgers lay stacked neatly. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the spines. Dates stretched back many years. She opened one carefully. She asked about the memorial fund from years ago. Reverend Hart sighed. He said it had been a difficult time. Donations had been collected for repairs to the tower after a storm. Money had gone missing. Finch had been appointed to review the accounts. He had found discrepancies. Then the matter had been resolved quietly. The missing funds had been replaced. No explanation was recorded. Miss Marple asked who had replaced the money. Reverend Hart hesitated. He said the replacement came anonymously. The village had been relieved. No scandal. No blame. Miss Marple thanked him and closed the ledger. Anonymous generosity often hides anonymous fear. As she left the church, she saw Mrs. Crampton standing near the notice board. She appeared absorbed in reading. Miss Marple approached slowly. They exchanged pleasantries. Mrs. Crampton spoke quickly. Too quickly. She said the village was being unfairly judged. She said gossip could ruin everything they had built. Miss Marple nodded kindly. She asked whether Finch had seemed worried recently. Mrs. Crampton stiffened. She said Finch worried about many things. Order. Rules. She laughed softly. She said some people cannot let go of the past. Miss Marple agreed. She said the past often refuses to be let go. That evening Miss Marple visited Miss Arden's guest house. The windows glowed warmly. Laughter drifted from inside. Miss Arden greeted her with practiced charm. They sat in the small sitting room. Miss Arden poured tea with steady hands. She spoke of business difficulties, of guests cancelling, of the need for calm. Miss Marple asked whether Finch had visited recently. Miss Arden hesitated. Then she said yes. He had asked questions about a former guest, a man who had stayed years ago, a man who had donated generously to village causes, a man who had asked for anonymity. Miss Marple felt another piece slide into place. She asked what Finch had wanted to know. Miss Arden said he wanted dates, names, connections. She said she had felt uncomfortable. She said she had asked Finch to leave. He had done so politely but firmly. He had said the village deserved honesty. Miss Marple thanked her and rose to go. As she left, she noticed a framed photograph on the wall. A group gathered near the tower. Younger faces. A banner announcing the memorial fund. She paused and looked closely. Mrs. Crampton stood near the centre. Mr. Pike beside her. Miss Arden at the edge. Finch stood behind them, already watchful. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit her lamp. Darkness settled outside. The tower was invisible now, but she felt its presence like a shadow. She thought of fear again, fear of exposure, fear of old mistakes resurfacing. Finch had begun asking questions. He had begun connecting names and dates. He had begun to reopen a wound the village had agreed to close. Someone had decided to stop him. Not with noise, not with drama. With quiet precision. The stop clock was a warning, a message frozen in time. A reminder of a moment when things had almost come undone before. Miss Marple considered who had the most to lose. Who had replaced the missing money anonymously? Who had benefited from silence? She considered Mrs. Crampton, who handled funds. Mr. Pike, who valued reputation above truth. Miss Arden, who had sheltered a donor whose past might not bear light. The truth lay in their shared history, in their shared agreement to forget. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. The fire burned low. The needles moved steadily. She knew now that the crime had not been born of sudden anger. It had been planned quietly, patiently, over time. It had waited for the right moment, for the moment when Finch's questions became dangerous. The village believed it lived by routine, by bells and hours and meetings. Someone had used that belief. Soon, the past would speak again, and when it did, the silence that had protected so many would finally break. Miss Marple was ready. Chapter 4. The clock began to move again on a quiet morning, when frost still clung to the grass. Mr. Rook returned at dawn, his tools packed with care, his manner reserved. Constable Wren stood nearby as the repairman climbed the tower steps once more. This time the village did not gather in a crowd. People watched from windows, from doorways, from behind the safety of routine. Miss Marple stood near the edge of the green, her posture relaxed, her gaze attentive. She knew that when time resumes, people hope the past will settle back into place. It rarely does. The mechanism was reset carefully, the weight reattached, the gears aligned. Mr. Rook worked in silence, except for the soft sound of metal and wood. At precisely 9:10 the clock ticked. A sound so familiar it felt strange after days of absence. A few villagers sighed in relief. Others stiffened. When the first chime rang out, it echoed across the green. Life moved again. Children resumed play. Shops opened their doors. The illusion of normality returned quickly. Miss Marple noticed who reacted and how. Mrs. Crampton flinched at the sound. She recovered quickly, smoothing her coat, but the reaction had been instinctive. Mr. Pike smiled broadly, speaking to those around him, his voice louder than necessary. Miss Arden turned her face away from the tower, as if the sound irritated her. Time resumed, but unease remained. That afternoon, Constable Wren began formal interviews. He moved with patience. He did not accuse. He asked questions. He watched faces. Miss Marple was not present for the interviews, yet she knew the rhythm of them. Questions unsettle people not because of what they ask, but because of what they remind. She spent the morning in her garden. She pruned gently. She watched birds settle and lift again. The world offers many lessons if one is willing to observe quietly. In the early afternoon, Mrs. Crampton arrived unannounced. She spoke of business, of charity drives, of the strain recent events had placed on everyone. Her voice trembled slightly despite her effort to remain composed. Miss Marple invited her to sit. She offered tea. She listened. Mrs. Crampton spoke at length. Too much length. She defended her honesty. She explained accounting methods that did not require explanation. She mentioned the memorial fund without being asked. Miss Marple waited until the cup was half empty. Then she asked a simple question. She asked whether Finch had discovered the truth about the anonymous donation. Mrs. Crampton froze. Only for a moment. But that moment spoke loudly. She said Finch had been mistaken. She said the past was settled. She said digging served no purpose. Miss Marple nodded. She said some people believe that. She said others believe truth has its own purpose. Mrs. Crampton left soon after. Her steps on the path were hurried. Later, Mr. Pike called. He spoke of council matters, of restoring confidence. He suggested a small ceremony to mark the clock's return. A symbol of unity. Miss Marple agreed politely. She said symbols are powerful things. After the call, she sat quietly and thought of symbols again. The clock, the chosen time, 11:40. She now knew what it marked. Years ago, the memorial fund had been announced at 11:40. She remembered the church bell schedule. She remembered standing in the green. She remembered Finch beside her, already serious even then. That had been the moment the fund was declared complete. The moment applause had sounded. The moment missing money had been replaced quietly. The time had been chosen because it remembered a lie. The ceremony was planned for the following evening. Villagers gathered once more beneath the tower. Lights were strung. Words were prepared. Mr. Pike spoke of healing. He praised Finch's service. He spoke of moving forward. Miss Marple watched faces again. Mrs. Crampton stood rigid. Miss Arden looked pale. Mr. Pike smiled carefully. When the speech ended, Miss Marple stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She spoke of habits, of how people return to places and moments that matter to them. She spoke of Finch's devotion to order. She spoke of how he would never ignore a stopped clock. The village listened. Silence fell, the same silence that had lingered when the clock stopped. She said Finch had found something in the old records. Something about money and names and dates. Something that frightened more than one person. She said someone had decided to stop time at the moment that lie was born. No one interrupted her. She looked toward Mrs. Crampton. She said the donation had been replaced by someone who feared exposure. She said Finch had begun tracing the source. She said the fear returned. Mrs. Crampton shook her head. Tears filled her eyes. She said she had only meant to protect the village. She said the donor had threatened harm if exposed. She said Finch would not let the matter rest. Miss Marple said she understood fear. She said fear often leads to terrible decisions. Constable Wren stepped forward then. He spoke calmly. He said the evidence supported Miss Marple's account. The oil. The mechanism. The timing. Mrs. Crampton's shoulders sagged. She did not resist when the constable took her arm. The clock chimed softly behind them. Time moved on. The village changed after that. Not suddenly. Change rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, like dawn. Mrs. Crampton's arrest unsettled many. Some felt relief. Others felt shame. People realized how long they had accepted silence as peace. Miss Marple sat at her window the next morning, watching the tower. The clock marked each hour faithfully. Its sound felt different now. Not ominous, honest. Constable Wren visited later that day. He thanked her. He said Finch's records had been found hidden beneath floorboards in the tower. Finch had planned to present them to authorities. He had written notes, dates, connections. Miss Marple nodded. She said Finch believed truth should be handled properly. The constable said Mrs. Crampton had confessed fully. She had feared losing everything. She had planned only to frighten Finch. She had followed him into the tower. She had spoken his name sharply in the dark. He had turned. He had stumbled. The fall had done the rest. She had stopped the clock beforehand to draw him there. She had not intended death. Intent does not change consequence. Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a quiet sadness. The village held a small service for Finch. No speeches, no ceremony, just presence. The clock chimed once as they stood together. Life resumed. Shops opened. Children laughed again. The tower stood unchanged, yet everyone saw it differently now. Miss Marple returned to her routines. Knitting, walking, watching. One evening she paused beneath the tower as the light faded. The hands moved steadily. She thought of how time reveals what people hide, how patience allows truth to surface. The village would remember this quietly. In small ways. In careful glances. In moments when silence felt too heavy. Miss Marple walked home with calm steps. The case was resolved, yet the lesson remained. Time cannot be stopped without cost, and truth always waits. Chapter 5. The days that followed the revelation passed with a strange gentleness. The village did not collapse into chaos as some had feared. Instead, it moved as if walking on newly mended ground. Careful. Aware, quieter than before. Miss Marple noticed this immediately. People greeted one another with more attention. Conversations paused more often. There was a new respect for silence. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of reflection. The clock tower stood at the center of it all. Steady now, its ticking audible even from a distance. Each sound seemed to remind the village that time does not erase truth. It only carries it forward. Miss Marple walked beneath the tower one afternoon as the light slanted low across the green. The air smelled of winter and wood smoke. Children played nearby, their laughter cautious at first, then freer. Life had resumed, but it had not forgotten. She paused and looked up. The hands moved with calm authority. She felt no resentment toward the tower. It had only done what it was made to do. It was people who had asked it to lie. Constable Wren visited her later that evening. He removed his cap and held it politely, as if still standing in a church. He told her the final details. Mrs. Crampton had acted alone. The anonymous donor had been a relative whose financial dealings were questionable. Exposure would have destroyed her livelihood and reputation. Finch had discovered the connection and refused to remain silent. She had believed fear could solve the problem. She had believed she could frighten Finch into delaying. Instead, she had startled him on the stairs. A moment. A misstep. A consequence that could not be undone. Miss Marple listened without judgment. She did not interrupt. When the constable finished, she nodded once. She said quietly that most terrible acts begin as attempts to avoid discomfort. Constable Wren agreed. He said the village would take time to heal. He said Finch would be remembered kindly. He said he wished all cases were guided with such clarity. Miss Marple smiled gently. She said clarity often waits for patience. After he left, she sat by her fire and reflected on Finch, a man devoted to order, to fairness, to accuracy. He had trusted systems and records. He had believed that truth, once placed in the proper hands, would be handled responsibly. She wondered if he had felt afraid that night, or only surprised. The thought saddened her. The following Sunday, the church bells rang again, not for ceremony, not for announcement, just routine. Miss Marple attended the service. She sat quietly among the villagers. The sermon spoke of accountability and forgiveness. It was not pointed. It did not need to be. Afterward, people lingered in the churchyard. Conversations flowed more openly. Miss Arden spoke with Mrs. Bell. Mr. Pike stood alone for a while. His confidence softened. He had lost the certainty that reputation could protect everything. Miss Marple exchanged small words with each of them. She did not press. The truth had already pressed hard enough. As she walked home, she passed the tower once more. She thought of how carefully the crime had been planned, how subtle it had been. No noise, no struggle witnessed, only a pause in time. She also thought of how fragile such plans truly are. They rely on silence, and silence is never permanent. The evening settled gently. The clock chimed. One sound, then another. Miss Marple returned to her chair and took up her knitting. The pattern was nearly complete now. She worked steadily, the rhythm comforting. Somewhere in the village a door closed. Somewhere a light went out. Somewhere a truth had finally been allowed to rest. She knew this would not be the last time she observed such things. Villagers repeat their mistakes. People convince themselves they can manage fear quietly. Yet she also knew that patience and observation remain powerful tools. More powerful than force. More powerful than secrecy. She finished the final row and set the knitting aside. The clock chimed again. Time moved on. Weeks passed, and the village settled into a new rhythm. Not identical to the old one, but honest in a way it had not been before. The tower marked each hour faithfully, its presence steady rather than ominous. Miss Marple noticed that people now listened when it chimed. They paused. They checked their watches. They acknowledged it, as if they no longer took time for granted. She continued her daily walks. She continued to observe. Old habits softened. New ones formed. Mrs. Bell's tea shop grew lively again. Conversations returned, though gossip was gentler now, more cautious. Miss Arden's guest house filled slowly. Guests sensed the calm beneath the village's careful manners. Mr. Pike resigned from the parish council quietly. He said he wished to rest. Another took his place, someone younger, someone less invested in appearances. Miss Marple felt no satisfaction in this, only balance. One late afternoon she climbed the small hill opposite the tower. From there she could see the rooftops, the green, the lanes curling outward like quiet thoughts. She sat on a bench and watched the light change. The clock face glowed softly as the sun lowered. The hands moved without drama, as they should. She thought again of Finch, of how he had trusted order, of how he had believed that systems protect people. Systems do not protect. People do, and people fail. That is why observation matters. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Constable Wren again. This time he smiled easily. No notebook, no urgency. He said he would be transferred soon. Another posting. Another village. She wished him well. She told him to watch for the quiet moments. He said he would remember that. As he left, she remained seated, her hands folded in her lap. The clock chimed 6. Miss Marple rose and walked home. That evening she wrote a letter, not to authorities, not to officials, to Finch's sister. She spoke kindly of him. She said he had been right to care. She said his sense of duty had not been misplaced. She sealed the envelope and set it aside. Later she sat by the window and watched the night deepen. The tower stood silhouetted against the dark. The ticking reached her faintly through the stillness. She felt no need to hurry, no need to explain herself to anyone. The village understood enough. Mysteries do not end with answers. They end with acceptance. Miss Marple turned off her lamp and let the quiet settle. Outside the clock continued its steady work. Inside the village continued its slow healing. And time, patient as always, moved forward. The village returned to its quiet ways. though it was a different quiet now. Not the silence of avoidance, but the calm that comes after truth has been spoken and accepted. The clock tower stood as it always had, steady and watchful, marking each hour without judgment. Miss Marple continued her routines. She knitted by the window. She walked the lanes. She listened more than she spoke. To anyone passing through, nothing seemed unusual. Yet those who lived there knew something had shifted. They no longer trusted appearances alone. They noticed pauses. They remembered details. The clock chimed in the evenings, and people listened. Mr. Finch's name was spoken with respect, not with drama, but with understanding. He had believed in order, and in the end, order had returned. Not because time was controlled, but because truth was allowed to move freely again. Miss Marple never claimed credit. She never needed to. Observation had done its work, as it always does. One evening, as the light faded and the tower cast a long shadow across the green, Miss Marple paused and looked up. The hands moved calmly forward. Time had resumed its proper place. And the village, wiser now, let it.